The courtroom was quiet except for the soft hum of machines running in the background. It was a high-tech space filled with glowing screens and holographic displays that floated above desks. Lena Carter stood at the center of it all, her dark suit crisp and professional. She looked calm, but inside she felt the weight of what was happening. Across from her sat Judge Harold Grant, an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared challenge him. His face showed no emotion as he listened, or pretended to listen, to Lena speak. Lena had spent weeks preparing for this case. Her client, a young programmer named Kevin, was accused of stealing classified data from a government server. The evidence against him wasn't strong, but prosecutors had pushed hard to make sure he didn't walk free. Lena knew how important this case was. If she could prove Kevin innocent, it would set a precedent for other cases like his. But if she failed, it might send a message that the system didn't care about fairness or truth. "Your Honor," Lena began, her voice steady and clear, "the prosecution has not provided sufficient evidence to support their claims. My client has been falsely accused, and I ask that you dismiss these charges immediately." Judge Grant leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. He glanced at the glowing screen in front of him, where lines of text scrolled by automatically. The AI-assisted system was analyzing every word spoken in the room, cross-referencing legal precedents and suggesting possible rulings. Still, Grant liked to think he was in control. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Ms. Carter," he said finally, his tone polite but firm. "The prosecution has presented enough evidence to warrant further investigation. Your motion to dismiss is denied." Lena took a deep breath. This wasn't unexpected, but it was still frustrating. She had seen judges like Grant before, men who acted like they were untouchable, who believed their opinions mattered more than facts. She decided to push harder. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, stepping closer to the judge's bench, "the so-called evidence is circumstantial at best. There's no direct link between my client and the alleged crime. Furthermore, we've brought expert witnesses who can testify to Kevin's innocence." Grant raised an eyebrow. "Expert witnesses, really? And how credible are they?" "They're highly qualified professionals," Lena replied quickly. "One is a cybersecurity specialist who reviewed the logs from the server in question. Another is a forensic analyst who examined the timestamps on the files. Both confirm that my client couldn't have committed the act he's accused of." For a moment, Grant just stared at her. Then he sighed loudly, as if he were dealing with someone too stubborn to understand basic logic. "Ms. Carter, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's be realistic here. These kinds of cases rarely hinge on technical details. What matters is intent, and your client had access to sensitive information. That alone raises serious questions." Lena clenched her fists under the table. She wanted to argue, to point out that having access didn't mean committing a crime, but she knew better than to lose her temper. Instead, she nodded politely. "I understand your concerns, Your Honor. However, dismissing intent without proper evidence sets a dangerous precedent. If we convict people based solely on suspicion, then what happens to due process?" Grant waved a hand dismissively. "Due process doesn't mean letting criminals go scot-free. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." At that moment, Lena felt something shift inside her. She realized that no matter what she said, Grant wasn't going to listen. He had already made up his mind, and nothing she did would change it. Still, she refused to give up. For Kevin's sake, she needed to try one last time. "Then perhaps we should consider the bigger picture," she said, choosing her words carefully. "If we allow accusations without proof to stand, we risk undermining trust in the entire legal system. Is that really what we want?" Grant frowned. He opened his mouth to respond, then paused as if reconsidering. For a brief second, Lena thought she might have gotten through to him. But then he shook his head and leaned forward. "I've heard. Enough, Ms. Carter. The motion to dismiss is denied. We'll proceed to trial next week." The words hit Lena like a punch to the gut. She forced herself to nod again, keeping her expression neutral. "Thank you, Your Honor," she murmured, before turning away. As she gathered her papers and walked toward the exit, She couldn't help but notice the smug look on the prosecutor's face. He had won, for now, but Lena wasn't ready to admit defeat. Outside the courtroom, Lena found a quiet corner where she could think. She pulled out her phone and called her assistant, asking for an update on the case. While they talked, she replayed the hearing in her mind, analyzing every detail. Something about Grant's behavior bothered her. He hadn't just dismissed her arguments, he had gone out of his way to belittle them. It was almost as if he didn't take her seriously. Because of who she was, and maybe that was true. Lena had faced prejudice before, both subtle and overt. She knew some people doubted her abilities simply because she was a black woman, but usually she managed to win them over with her skill and determination. Not this time, though. This time, it felt personal. As the call ended, Lena noticed a small notification flashing on her phone. It was from Director Echo, the AI liaison overseeing her undercover mission. She tapped the screen, and a hologram of a glowing figure appeared in front of her. "Agent Carter," the AI said in its smooth, mechanical voice. "Report status." Lena glanced around to make sure no one was watching. Satisfied that she was alone, she spoke softly. "Mission partially successful. Judge Grant ruled against me, just as expected. But there's something else. I think he's deliberately targeting attorneys of color. His comments during the hearing suggest bias." Director, Echo processed this information quickly. "Confirmed patterns indicate systemic bias in Judge Grant's rulings. Additional analysis required. Proceed to Phase 2. Phase 2. That meant revealing her true identity. Lena had known this moment would come eventually, but she hadn't expected it to feel so heavy. She was about to turn the tables on Grant, exposing him for the biased judge he was. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't solve everything. Even if she succeeded, the larger problem remained, a justice system riddled with flaws and prejudices. Still, she had a job to do. Taking a deep breath, Lena straightened her shoulders and headed back into the courthouse. Tomorrow would be a new day, and she intended to make the most of it. The morning after the hearing was cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over Atlanta. Lena woke up early, her mind already racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She hadn't slept much the night before, tossing and turning as she replayed every moment of the courtroom scene in her head. Judge Grant's dismissive tone, his refusal to listen to reason, it all felt personal now. But Lena couldn't let her emotions get in the way. She had a mission, and failure wasn't an option. After getting dressed, she sat at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee and opened her laptop. On the screen was a secure connection to Director Echo, the AI liaison overseeing her undercover work. The glowing figure appeared almost instantly, hovering above the desk like a ghost. "Agent Carter," Echo said in its calm, mechanical voice. "Phase 2 initiated. Confirm readiness." Lena nodded. "I'm ready. What's the plan?" Echo paused for a moment, processing data. "Analysis of Judge Grant's past rulings reveals consistent bias against attorneys of color. Additional patterns suggest manipulation of AI-assisted protocols to favor specific outcomes. Your task is to expose these discrepancies during tomorrow's session." Lena frowned. "Manipulation? How does he do that?" "Grant exploits loopholes. In JusticeNet," Echo explained. "He inputs biased keywords into case summaries, which skews the AI's recommendations. Furthermore, he selectively overrides automated decisions based on personal preferences." Lena sighed. It wasn't surprising, really. People always found ways to game the system, even when technology was supposed to make things fairer. Still, hearing it confirmed made her blood boil. She clenched her fists under the table but forced herself to stay focused. "What's my role?" she asked. "You will present evidence of systemic bias during the tribunal review," Echo replied. "To gain credibility, you must first reveal your true identity as a senior U.S. attorney for the Department of Justice Oversight Division." Revealing her identity, that part worried Lena the most. Sure, it would shock everyone in the courtroom, especially Judge Grant, but it also meant stepping out of the shadows, putting herself directly in the spotlight. She'd spent months undercover, pretending to be just another lawyer fighting for justice. Now she'd have to show the world who she really was, and risk being labeled a fraud or worse. "I understand," she said finally. "What tools do I have access to?" Echo projected a series of files onto the screen. Encrypted logs, behavioral analytics, and testimonies from former clerks. Use them strategically to dismantle Grant's defenses. Lena scrolled through the documents, absorbing every detail. There were transcripts of private conversations, facial recognition scans showing Grant's micro-expressions, and even recordings of his interactions with other attorneys. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Judge Grant wasn't just biased. He was corrupt. By mid-morning, Lena had memorized enough information to build her case. She grabbed her briefcase and headed out the door, determined to visit someone who might hold the key to unraveling this mess, a former clerk named Rachel Monroe. Rachel lived in a small apartment downtown, far from the polished halls of the courthouse. When Lena arrived, she knocked softly on the door. After a moment, it creaked open, revealing a young woman with tired eyes and messy hair. Rachel looked surprised to see her. "Ms. Carter?" she said hesitantly. "What are you doing here?" "I need your help," Lena replied, stepping inside. "It's about Judge Grant." Rachel shut the door behind her and gestured for Lena to sit down. The apartment was cluttered, but cozy, with stacks of books piled on every surface. Lena noticed a framed photo on the wall, a younger Rachel standing next to Judge Grant, smiling brightly. "You used to work for him, right?" Lena asked. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, for 3 years, but I quit last month, couldn't take it anymore." "Why not?" Rachel hesitated, then sighed. "He wasn't fair. Not just to defendants, but to his staff, too. He treated us differently, depending on our race, gender, everything, and if you disagreed with him, he'd make your life hell." Lena leaned forward, her expression serious. "Did he ever say anything discriminatory? Anything you remember clearly?" Rachel thought for a moment. "Once he called me too emotional because I disagreed with one of his rulings. Another time he told me I should focus on less complicated cases, since I wasn't as experienced as the others. But it wasn't just me. He did the same thing to other women and people of color." Lena nodded, jotting notes on her tablet. "And what about attorneys? Did he treat them differently too?" "Oh, definitely," Rachel said. "I remember him rolling his eyes whenever a black attorney spoke. He'd interrupt them constantly like they didn't know what they were talking about. Once I heard him refer to one of them as just another activist playing dress-up." The words sent a chill down Lena's spine. That sounded exactly like the kind of comment Grant would make. She thanked Rachel for her time and promised to keep her updated on the case. As she left the apartment, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Rachel's testimony and the evidence from Echo, she could prove beyond doubt that Grant was unfit to serve as a judge. Back at her office, Lena spent hours organizing her materials. She created timelines, highlighted key moments, and prepared visual aids to present during the tribunal. By the time evening rolled around, her desk was covered in papers and holographic projections. Exhausted but satisfied, she leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't just about Judge Grant anymore. It was about sending a message to the legal system, to society, to anyone who thought they could abuse their power without consequences. Lena knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, skepticism, maybe even backlash, but she was ready. For Kevin, for Rachel, and for everyone else affected by Grant's actions, she would fight until the bitter end. As she packed up her things and turned off the lights, Lena allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow, she would walk into that courtroom, not just as Lena Carter, the lawyer, but as Agent Carter, the investigator, and Judge Grant would finally learn the truth. The next morning, Lena arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. She wanted to make sure everything was in place before the hearing began. Her heart raced as she walked through the familiar hallways, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The air felt heavier today, charged with anticipation. She knew this day would change things, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Inside the courtroom, technicians were already setting up equipment. Holographic screens buzzed to life, displaying case files and procedural guidelines. Lena took her seat at the defense table and began arranging her notes. Every document, every piece of evidence had been carefully prepared. She glanced at Judge Grant, who sat behind his bench, scrolling through something on his tablet. His expression was calm, almost bored, as if he didn't realize what was about to happen. When the bailiff called the room to order, Lena stood up and approached the judge's bench. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "Your Honor," she began, "before we proceed, I'd like to address a matter that affects the integrity of this case." Grant looked up from his tablet, his eyebrows raised. "What is it now, Ms. Carter?" Lena reached into her briefcase and pulled out a badge. It gleamed under the courtroom lights as she held it up for everyone to see. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the hum of the machine seemed to fade away. "I am not just a defense attorney," Lena said, her voice clear and strong. "I am a senior U.S. attorney assigned to the Department of Justice Oversight Division. My presence here has been part of an investigation into allegations of bias within our judicial system." For a moment, no one moved. Judge Grant stared at her, his face pale. Then he leaned back in his chair, trying to appear composed, but Lena could see the panic in his eyes. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "You've deceived this court. What gives you the authority to conduct such an investigation?" Lena placed the badge on the edge of his desk. "My authority comes directly from federal oversight protocols. Over the past several months, I've gathered substantial evidence of discriminatory practices within your courtroom. With respect, Your Honor, your actions have violated both ethical standards and the law." The prosecutor, sitting across from Lena, looked stunned. He whispered something to his assistant, who quickly began typing on her laptop. Reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Grant tried to regain control of the situation. "Even if this is true, and I'm not admitting anything, you cannot simply accuse me without proof. Where's your evidence?" Lena turned to the holographic display behind her and tapped a few commands. Instantly, lines of text and images appeared in mid-air. They showed statistics, transcripts, and video clips, all pointing to patterns of bias in Grant's rulings. One clip showed him interrupting a black attorney mid-sentence, while another highlighted how often he dismissed motions filed by attorneys of color. "This data has been analyzed by JusticeNet," Lena explained. "It confirms that you've dismissed cases brought by minority attorneys at a significantly higher rate than those led by white attorneys. Furthermore, encrypted logs reveal that you've manipulated AI-assisted protocols to favor specific outcomes." Grant's face turned red. "This is absurd. I follow the law to the letter. Any discrepancies are coincidental." Lena shook her head. "Coincidence doesn't explain why you referred to me as just another activist playing dress-up during a private conversation last week, or why former clerks have testified about your discriminatory remarks behind closed doors." At that moment, the courtroom doors opened and Rachel Monroe stepped inside. She looked nervous but determined as she walked toward the front. Lena nodded at her, silently thanking her for coming forward. "Your Honor," Lena continued, "Ms. Monroe worked as your clerk until recently. She can confirm many of these allegations." Grant slammed his fist on the desk. "Enough. This is a mockery of justice. I demand a recess." But Lena wasn't finished. "A federal review panel has already been dispatched. They'll be conducting a real-time audit of your records and past rulings. Until then, your access to the bench is suspended." The tension in the room was palpable. Some people gasped, while others whispered excitedly. Cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to capture every detail. For the first time, Judge Grant looked truly vulnerable. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. As the bailiff escorted Grant out of the courtroom, Lena turned to face the audience. Her voice softened, but it carried weight. "This isn't about one judge," she said. "It's about accountability. Our justice system relies on fairness and transparency. When those values are compromised, we all suffer. Today, we take a step toward fixing what's broken." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some clapped quietly, while others looked unsure. Outside the courthouse, news vans lined the streets, broadcasting live updates. Within minutes, social media lit up with reactions. Some praised Lena as a hero, while others accused her of overstepping her bounds. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse had transformed into a hive of activity. Reporters crowded the hallways, microphones in hand, trying to get statements from anyone willing to talk. Lawyers whispered among themselves, speculating about what would happen next. Even the judges who usually kept to themselves were discussing the unprecedented events unfolding around them. At the center of it all was Lena Carter, whose bold move earlier that day had sent shockwaves through the legal community. The special tribunal convened in a larger courtroom than usual. It was designed to handle high-profile cases, with rows of seats for observers and multiple screens displaying live updates. Lena sat at a table near the front, surrounded by documents and holographic displays. She looked calm, but inside, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just another hearing, it was a test of the entire justice system. Judge Grant appeared shortly after, escorted by 2 federal marshals. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he took his seat at the defendant's table. He glanced at Lena, his eyes filled with anger and disbelief. For years he had ruled over others, confident in his authority. Now, he was the one being judged. The tribunal panel consisted of 3 members, 2 senior judges, and a legal ethics expert. They sat behind a raised bench, their expressions neutral as they reviewed the case materials. A drone hovered above the room, recording everything for the official record. The atmosphere was tense like the calm before a storm. "Proceed," said Judge Emily Park, the head of the panel, her voice firm but measured. Lena stood up and approached the podium. She took a deep breath, then began speaking. "Your Honors, I stand before you today not only as an attorney but as an investigator, tasked with uncovering systemic bias within our judicial system. Over the past several months, I have gathered evidence showing that Judge Harold Grant has consistently displayed discriminatory behavior in his rulings. These actions undermine public trust in the fairness of our courts." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she turned to the holographic display behind her and tapped a command. Data appeared in the air, charts, graphs, and video clips, all pointing to patterns of bias. For example, Lena continued, analysis of JusticeNet logs reveals that Judge Grant has dismissed motions filed by attorneys of color at a rate 83% higher than those led by white attorneys. Additionally, encrypted transcripts show him using derogatory language in private conversations. Witnesses, including former clerks, have confirmed these allegations. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He whispered something to his lawyer, a tall man with sharp features and an expensive suit. The lawyer nodded but didn't interrupt. Lena pressed on. Furthermore, Judge Grant has exploited loopholes in AI-assisted protocols to manipulate outcomes. By inputting biased keywords into case summaries, he skewed JusticeNet's recommendations, effectively overriding its impartiality. One of the tribunal judges leaned forward, frowning. "Ms. Carter, are you suggesting that the AI itself is flawed?" "No, Your Honor," Lena replied. JusticeNet is a powerful tool, but it relies on human input. If someone enters biased data, the system reflects that bias. My investigation shows that Judge Grant deliberately manipulated this process to favor certain defendants while disadvantaging others. The courtroom fell silent as the judges absorbed this information. Some observers scribbled notes, while others simply stared at the glowing screens, processing the implications. Finally, Judge Park turned to Grant. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Grant stood up slowly, his face red with frustration. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice shaking. "I've served this court faithfully for decades. Any discrepancies in my rulings are purely coincidental. Ms. Carter's so-called investigation is nothing more than entrapment." Lena clenched her fists under the table but kept her expression neutral. She had expected this response. People, like Grant, always defended themselves by denying responsibility. "Entrapment?" she countered. "If following the law is entrapment, then why did you feel the need to manipulate the system?" Why did you dismiss cases based on race or gender instead of merit? Grant glared at her but didn't answer. Instead, he sat back down, muttering under his breath. The tribunal continued for hours, with both sides presenting arguments and evidence. Witnesses testified, including Rachel Monroe, who recounted her experiences working for Grant. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of a judge who believed himself above reproach, treating colleagues and defendants differently based on their backgrounds. As the day wore on, public opinion began to shift. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and bias has no place in court." Social media buzzed with hashtags supporting Lena and criticizing Grant. News outlets aired debates, with commentators arguing over whether her methods were justified. Some praised Lena as a hero, calling her actions a necessary step toward reform. Others accused her of overreach, saying she had undermined the legal process by going undercover. Even her colleagues were divided. Some congratulated her privately, while others avoided her altogether, unsure of where they stood. Despite the controversy, Lena remained focused. She knew the tribunal's decision wouldn't come immediately. It would take time to review all the evidence. But she also knew she had struck a blow against corruption, no matter the outcome. That evening, as the courthouse emptied, Lena stayed behind to organize her notes. She felt drained, but satisfied. Whatever happened next, she had done her job. She had exposed the truth, and that was something no one could take away from her. As she walked out into the cool night air, she noticed a small group of supporters waiting for her. They cheered quietly when they saw her, holding up signs of encouragement. Lena smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to hope, not just for Kevin's case, but for the future of justice itself. The days following the tribunal hearing were a whirlwind of activity. News outlets covered every detail, replaying clips of Lena's testimony and Judge Grant's defensive outbursts. Social media exploded with opinions, dividing people into two camps: those who supported Lena's bold move and those who thought she had gone too far. For Lena, it was exhausting, but necessary. She knew that exposing corruption often came with backlash, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply personal the criticism would feel. Inside the courthouse, the tribunal panel worked tirelessly to review the evidence. The judges pored over transcripts, analyzed AI logs, and listened to testimonies from witnesses like Rachel Monroe. Every piece of data was scrutinized, every argument weighed carefully. It was a slow process, but Lena understood why it had to be thorough. Justice couldn't afford to rush. Meanwhile, Lena tried to focus on her daily routine. She visited Kevin, her client, to update him on the case. He was nervous but hopeful, clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, he would walk free. Lena reassured him as best she could, though she avoided making promises she couldn't keep. "You've done so much already," Kevin said during one of their meetings. "I don't know how to thank you." Lena smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me, just hang in there, we're getting closer." But even as she encouraged Kevin, Lena couldn't ignore the growing tension around her. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, colleagues, and strangers. Some praised her courage, others accused her of playing games with the legal system. One email stood out, a long rant calling her a fraud and demanding she resign. Lena deleted it without responding. She didn't have time for negativity. One evening, after another long day at the courthouse, Lena decided to take a walk. The city streets were alive with energy, cars honking and people chatting as they passed by. She needed a moment to clear her head, to step away from the noise and think about what all this meant, not just for her, but for the justice system as a whole. As she strolled through a quiet park, she noticed a man sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. When he saw her, he nodded politely. "You're Lena Carter, right?" he asked, his voice kind. Lena hesitated. She wasn't used to being recognized outside the courtroom. "Yes, I am. I just wanted to say thank you." The man continued. "What you're doing, it's important. My daughter's a lawyer, too. She's faced some of the same stuff you talked about. It means a lot to see someone stand up to it. Lena felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you for saying that. I'm just trying to do my job. Well, you're doing it well, the man said before returning to his paper. Moments like this kept Lena going. They reminded her why she had taken on this mission in the first place, but they also made her realize how much work still needed to be done. Exposing one corrupt judge wouldn't fix everything. There were deeper issues at play, issues that went beyond any single person. A few days later, the tribunal announced its decision. The courtroom was packed, with reporters jockeying for space and observers spilling into the hallways. Lena arrived, early, taking a seat near the front. She glanced at Judge Grant, who sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his face unreadable. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Grant didn't respond. When the judges entered, the room fell silent. Judge Park, the head of the panel, cleared her throat and began speaking. After careful review of the evidence presented, we find Judge Harold Grant guilty of ethical misconduct and bias-driven jurisprudence. His actions have undermined public trust in the fairness of our courts. As such, he is hereby removed from the bench and barred from holding judicial office in the future. The room erupted into murmurs. Some people clapped quietly, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Grant stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. For a moment, Lena thought he might say something, but he stayed silent. Judge Park continued. Furthermore, we recommend an immediate audit of AI-assisted protocols across all regional courts to ensure transparency and accountability. Bias, whether intentional or not, has no place in our justice system. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Lena felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because Grant had been held accountable. Unease because she knew this was only the beginning. Removing one bad judge wouldn't erase centuries of inequality. The fight for true justice was far from over. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and protesters waved signs. Lena pushed through the crowd, ignoring the noise as best she could. She spotted Rachel Monroe standing nearby, looking nervous but proud. "You did it," Rachel said, when Lena approached. "I can't believe it." "We did it," Lena corrected. "Without your help, none of this would have happened." Rachel smiled shyly. "Still, you're the one who took the risk. I just hope this makes a difference." "It will," Lena said firmly. "It has to." Later that night, Lena returned to her apartment and collapsed onto the couch. Her body ached from exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She flipped on the news, watching pundits debate the tribunal's decision. Some called it a victory for accountability. Others warned it set a dangerous precedent. Lena muted the TV and stared at the ceiling, reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about Kevin, whose case now had a chance of being dismissed. She thought about Rachel, who had found the courage to speak out. And she thought about all the other people who had suffered because of judges like Grant, people whose voices had been silenced for too long. For the first time in weeks, Lena allowed herself to cry, not out of sadness, but out of frustration, anger, and hope. Frustration at how broken the system still was, anger at how much resistance there had been, and hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better. When the tears subsided, she picked up her phone and sent a quick message to Director Echo. "Mission accomplished. What's next?" The AI responded almost instantly. "Further, assignments pending. Systemic reform requires sustained effort. Prepare for Phase 3. Phase 3. Lena sighed, knowing the road ahead would be just as challenging, if not more so than what she'd already faced. But she was ready. If anything, this experience had shown her the power of persistence. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. As she drifted off to sleep, Lena dreamed of a future where justice truly was blind, a world where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, had an equal shot at fairness. It was a dream worth fighting for. The weeks following Judge Grant's removal from the bench felt like a blur for Lena Carter. The public reaction was overwhelming, both positive and negative. Some hailed her as a hero who had taken a stand against corruption. Others accused her of overstepping boundaries and undermining the legal system. Debates raged on television, social media, and even in casual conversations at coffee shops. Lena tried to stay focused, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere she went, people recognized her face or called out her name. Kevin's case was dismissed shortly after the tribunal's decision. When Lena broke the news to him, he cried tears of relief. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice shaking. "You saved my life." Lena smiled softly. "You're free now. That's all that matters." But while Kevin's victory felt like progress, Lena knew it was just one small step. Removing Judge Grant had exposed flaws in the system, but fixing those flaws would take time and effort. Every day, new cases highlighted how deeply rooted bias was in the justice system. It wasn't just about individual judges. It was about the structures they operated within. One morning, Lena received an invitation to speak at a national conference on judicial reform. She hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't her favorite thing, and she worried about saying the wrong words. But Director Echo encouraged her, reminding her that her voice could inspire change. "You've earned this platform," Echo said during one of their secure calls. "Use it wisely." So Lena agreed. She spent days preparing her speech, thinking carefully about what she wanted to say. She didn't want to just talk about Judge Grant or her undercover mission. She wanted to address the bigger picture, the systemic issues that affected millions of people every day. On the day of the conference, Lena stood backstage, watching the crowd gather. Lawyers, judges, activists, and students filled the auditorium, chatting excitedly. Cameras lined the walls, ready to broadcast her words to a wider audience. Her heart raced as she waited for her turn to speak. When she finally walked onto the stage, the room fell silent. All eyes were on her. Lena took a deep breath and began. "Thank you for having me here today," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside her. "I'm not here to talk about myself. I'm here because we have work to do. What happened with Judge Grant wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that affects everyone whether they realize it or not." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she continued. "Our justice system is supposed to be fair. It's supposed to protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and uphold the law equally for all. But too often that isn't the case. Too often people are judged not by their actions but by their race, their gender, their background. And when that happens, trust erodes, hope fades, lives are destroyed." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Lena glanced at the audience, seeing nods of agreement and thoughtful expressions. She pressed on. "We can't fix everything overnight. Change takes time, effort, and courage. But we can start by holding ourselves accountable, by challenging biases, not just in others but in ourselves, by demanding transparency in our courts and fairness in our laws." She paused again, this time to let the weight of her message settle. Then she added, "Technology can help, but it's not a magic solution. AI systems like JusticeNet are tools, not replacements for human judgment. If we feed them biased data, they'll give us biased results. We need to be better than that, smarter than that." As she wrapped up her speech, Lena looked directly into the cameras. "This fight isn't just for lawyers or judges. It's for everyone. Because when justice fails, we all lose. Let's build a system we can believe in, a system that truly serves all of us." The applause was thunderous. People stood up, clapping and cheering, as Lena stepped back from the podium. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the support, but she reminded herself that applause wasn't enough. Words weren't enough. Real change required action. After the conference, Lena returned to her work with renewed determination. She collaborated with other attorneys and activists to push for reforms. They drafted proposals for stricter oversight of AI-assisted protocols, advocated for diversity training in courtrooms, and pushed for legislation to address systemic bias. It wasn't easy. There was resistance at every turn, but Lena refused to give up. One evening, as she worked late in her office, Rachel Monroe stopped by. She brought coffee and sat down across from Lena, watching her shuffle through papers. "How are you holding up?" Rachel asked gently. Lena sighed, setting down her pen. "I'm tired, but I'm okay. There's so much to do, you know." Rachel nodded. "Yeah, I get that. But you're making a difference. People are listening because of you." Lena smiled, faintly. "I hope so. Sometimes it feels like we're just scratching the surface." "That's how change starts," Rachel said, "scratching the surface until it cracks wide open." Her words stayed with Lena long after Rachel left. They reminded her why she kept going even when the road felt impossibly long. Progress wasn't perfect, but it was possible, and every small step mattered. A few months later, Lena received a new assignment from Director Echo. This time, it involved overseeing the integration of updated AI systems in federal courts. The goal was to create more transparent, unbiased tools that could assist judges without replacing their judgment. Lena accepted the challenge, knowing it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. As she walked into the courthouse one morning, a drone hovered above, recording her arrival. Lena glanced at it briefly before stepping inside. She didn't mind being watched anymore. In fact, she welcomed it. Accountability was key to building trust. Inside, she passed colleagues who greeted her warmly. Some still whispered about her role in exposing Judge Grant, but most treated her with respect. Lena had earned that respect, not just by uncovering corruption, but by working tirelessly to make things better. That afternoon, Lena met with Kevin for the first time since his case had been dismissed. He looked happier, healthier, and full of gratitude. "I got a job," he told her proudly. "It's not much, but it's something. I'm trying to move forward." Lena smiled. "That's wonderful. I'm proud of you." They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and laughter. Before leaving, Kevin handed Lena a small gift, a framed photo of himself smiling broadly, surrounded by family. "For everything you did," he said simply. Lena accepted it with tears in her eyes. She placed the photo on her desk where it joined a growing collection of reminders of why she fought so hard. That night, as she prepared to leave the office, Lena paused by the window. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of possibilities. She thought about the challenges ahead, the battles yet to be fought, the victories yet to be won. But she also thought about the people she had helped and the lives she had touched. Change wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But Lena believed in its power. She believed in the possibility of a fairer, kinder world. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting for it. With that thought, she turned off the lights and walked out into the cool night air. The future was uncertain, but it was full of promise. And Lena Carter was ready.